Hi, everybody. Welcome to the IWRA webinar for World Water Day 2008, Water for Nature. We're just going to start here in a few minutes, so this will give you a chance to grab a cup of coffee or a glass of tea or water, whatever's hourly appropriate for you. And we'll be starting in just a few minutes with our great panel. Thank you. Hi, everyone who's just joined us. It's 4 o'clock here in France, and we're going to start our 2018 World Water Day International Water Resources Association webinar in just a few minutes. So hold on, and we'll be ready for you in just a few minutes. Thanks. For those of you just joining us, this is the International Water Resources Association 2018 World Water Day webinar, and we're going to get started in just about 1 more minute. So this gives you kind of a last call chance to get ready and settled in. We'll be ready in just 1 minute. Okay, everyone, I want to welcome you all to the International Water Resources Association 2018 World Water Day webinar. We have a really great panel ready for you here today. We include Rebecca Welling, Lucy Lee, Catherine Cross, Carrie Wiesgel, and David Coates. And so they're going to be giving you some presentations about this year's World Water Day theme, Water for Nature. A lot of these presenters today come from the NGO and the nonprofit sectors, where they've spent years working on these kind of issues and themes, working on case studies, working on implementing projects which really closely deal with these issues. I know a lot of our webinars have a lot of academic themes, and so this brings you a little bit more of a practitioner side from things. I just want to remind you that this is a webinar hosted by the International Water Resources Association, and the IWRA is an international network of researchers and practitioners who work on a multidisciplinary range of water resource issues. We're a nonprofit, non-governmental educational organization, and the IWRA provides a global knowledge-based forum for bridging disciplines and geographies by connecting professionals, students, individuals, corporations, and institutions who are all concerned with the sustainable use of the world's water resources. If you want to know more information about us, you can go to our website, www.iwra.org, or just put it into the Google, and you'll learn all about our website. And if you want to become a member, you can do so right there on the website. Really happy to have you with us here today, and we're really glad to have you tuning in. So as many of you know, this is obviously the webinar based on World Water Day, and it's really a theme that's drawing a lot of attention across the water sector and even beyond. I mean, I think anyone who's probably picked up a newspaper today or turned on the television has seen some sort of notice and discussion about how this is World Water Day, and we know there's increasing issues of global water scarcity, commodification, privatization, and issues around human rights. There's so many issues that are dealing with water, and this is the day where people who come together and start thinking about water a little bit more. And I think it's also a day for people to get a bit more of a wider public interaction. So we're hoping that this webinar is reaching out to some people, and will hopefully change some minds and get some more education going on. So there's a lot of different ways that people are addressing these issues. One, is ecosystem resources, but also people are talking about broader pictures of implementing good governance around water for nature, and also bigger questions about the role of the society and respect for natural rights. So people are all kind of turning to this year's theme, water and nature, and we're hoping that our panelists are going to provide you a bunch of different insights about what the work they've been doing. So finally, if you have interest in continued discussion after you hear what we have today, please follow us up on social media. You can go to our LinkedIn webpage after the event, where we'll continue to have the discussion. You can continue talking and posting points, as well as Twitter. We are a group that likes to use Twitter, so go ahead and find us on Twitter, and you can keep tweeting. As I said, we have a broad, very distinguished panel with us here today, with Rebecca Welling from the International Union for Conservation of Nature, Lucy Lee from the World Wildlife Federation, Catherine Cross from the International Water Association, Carrie Wiesegel from the Nature Conservatory, and David Coates, who is an independent consultant. So just to let everyone know who hasn't already tuned into one of our webinars before, what we're going to do is have each of our panelists give a short presentation, and then at the end of that, we'll have questions from the audiences. And so you can see on your GoToWebinar control panel over on for me, it's on the right side of my screen. It could be anywhere else on your screen, but there's a section that says questions, and you can just type your question and I'll see it right away. I'd like to ask that, from our audience, that if you have a very specific question for one of our panelists, go ahead and just look them up and send them an email, and they can connect with you that way if it's a very specific question about their presentation. And if it's a broader question, that's what we're looking for, questions that sort of connect between different panelists or sort of engage across bigger themes. So go ahead and fire your questions away, and then let me know if it's for one or two of our panelists or if it's for the whole group. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn the floor over to Rebecca Welling.
Okay, thank you, Scott.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sounds great.
Okay, I'm just loading up my screen. Give me 2 seconds. Okay, can you see my screen?
Looks great.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction, Scott. Yes, my name is Rebecca Welling. I'm a project officer at IUCN as part of the Global Water Program. And I wanted to talk to you today about nature-based solutions for water, specifically focusing on natural infrastructure, which is a focus of our work in the water program at IUCN. So if you look here, for example, flood regulation, coastal defense, water provision, these critical services from nature equate to functions of infrastructure. And if you like, therefore, then with the term infrastructure defined as the stock of facilities, services, and installations needed for the functioning of a society and economy, then we could actually say that nature is part of the infrastructure portfolio of every country and every economy. So to give you an example, this is an infographic that we developed in our program, but it helps lay out the issues that you can see to better understand what natural infrastructure is and what it can do for water management. So for example, forests, aquifers, soils, lakes, and wetlands provide water storage. Wetlands and soils filter water rivers provide conveyance and transportation, and also the abundance of fish. Floodplains and wetlands lower flood peaks for downstream cities, for example, while mangroves and coastal areas and coral reefs can protect against coastal storms and inundation. So the way we see natural infrastructure is that it complements and augments, and in some situations can replace conventional built infrastructure like reservoirs, dams, or canals. But the composition, structure, and function of natural infrastructure in river basins and the way it interplays with built infrastructure determines these primary services and co-benefits produced. And we would also like to say that well-functioning natural infrastructure is necessary for built infrastructure to perform its functions better, to realize projected benefits and to secure returns on investment. Just to give you an example, dams, for example, benefit from forests that stabilize soils and hold back erosion upstream. Now, just generally to say, a natural infrastructure, a nature-based solution, as it's coined, this has been around for thousands of years. I think we're not saying that it's suddenly new. What we're saying is that actually we've lost touch a bit with nature, and what we need to do is think back to these natural processes and understand how to harness them better for a sustainable development. So you can see, if you look at different policy discourse and dialogue, that actually natural infrastructure has really gained and has been highlighted. The recent high-level panel on water outcome document that came out in the last few weeks. If you see, there are some quotes on the left-hand side of the screen that highlight this. And one of the key recommendations, I'll read it out, it says, value environmental contributions to water management, prevent degradation and pollution of rivers, lakes and aquifers, and where necessary, restore and maintain acceptable environmental conditions and water quality. So here you can really see, in other words, a call for investments in natural infrastructure for water management to address sustainability and throughout other policy agendas, for example, the SDGs. And I think key in terms of what we understand is that it's, and what you can see from this document as well, and other policy discourses, is fundamentally understanding how to balance built and natural infrastructure. It's not about saying one is better than the other. They both provide essential services, but it's about understanding within each basin the context, specific approach and solution package of combined natural and built portfolios. So with that in mind, I just thought today I'd provide you with a bit of information on a project that IUCN has led over the last 4 or 5 years that's just closed, called Wise Up to Climate. Wise Up is a multi-partnership program working in the Volta Basin in West Africa and the Tana Basin in Kenya. And it focuses on trying to highlight natural infrastructure as an adaptation strategy for climate change. So it's looked at mapping and valuing natural infrastructure benefits so that they are able to be considered alongside built infrastructure in investment strategies for climate change. Our hypothesis, our assumption at the beginning going into this is that there's information and there's data on built infrastructure, not less so for natural infrastructure. So for it to be put on the table and discussed equally, we need to build that information base. And the project has developed data that includes, as I said, both natural and built infrastructure data and options, but critically in trade-off analysis. So you can see the different options that you're weighing up, and through this we've been able to highlight the role of nature, demonstrating that water resource systems need to be conceptualized as portfolios, mixed portfolios of built and natural. So this is an infographic. I apologize, I realize the writing's a bit small for a presentation, but you can find all this on our website. But this is fundamentally one of the key lessons that have come out, and learning that has come out of the project, is also trying to understand natural and built infrastructure dynamics and the complexities of these dynamics, and how therefore we can highlight the particular benefits that natural infrastructure can play in water management and climate change adaptation. But again, I would highlight that it's important to understand that these interactions are very context specific and can vary between different basins. It's about understanding fundamentally the different benefits that you can get from different infrastructures and the mixing of them. So to just dive into one of the basins we worked in, we focused in West Africa on the White Volta Basin. And this was a specific site where there's going to be, well, there's planned new multi-purpose dam called the Pwalugu Dam. And this bit of infrastructure will no doubt impact the current flow regime. So as part of the work under the project, we mapped the natural infrastructure benefits in the Pwalugu area, so they can be considered alongside the potential benefits of the built infrastructure from the new dam. And you can see this from the map, the different infrastructures that we've included. And then from that, we combine that with valuation work, so to better understand what the actual value of these natural infrastructure benefits are. And through this infographic, what we've done is we've tried to combine the hydrological information with the valuation information to come together to provide you with a more holistic approach to and data set to understand the mapping and value of natural infrastructure in the area. On the right-hand side of the diagram, you can see two potential options for different operating rules for the new proposed dam. So this just shows you what are the trade-offs? What would happen if you built a dam that would prioritize hydropower generation, for example? What would that do to key natural infrastructure benefits? And certainly for us, in the area, it was highlighted that communities in this region rely on the current flow regime and the flooding for flood recession farming, floodplain cattle grazing, and fish catch. So these are the key benefits from the natural infrastructure, which translate into valuable incomes and food security, of course, for the villagers close by on the river. We calculated that to 53% of total household annual income, so it's not negligible. So yes, what the project then did was combine this information into a systems model, which allowed for a trade-off analysis. It's an oversimplified explanation, but the reality is that all of the information built up around natural infrastructure is then combined with built infrastructure information, and then what the model does is it selects different options and decisions. So an option is, for example, if you look at the graph on the slide, you could have flood recession farming, you can have energy, irrigation, the Pwalugu fish is the reservoir fishing from the proposed new dam. So these are all different options that are provided by infrastructure. And what the different colored lines show are the different combinations of solutions. So if you were to combine some built and some natural, what would that provide you with in terms of the spread of benefits? And I've just listed on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the possible trade-offs. And one of the key things that the project tried to do was to provide this information for discussion. It wasn't there to recommend and say this is what you should do, but it's about opening up the discussion, highlighting the role of natural infrastructure, putting it on the table as an option, and opening up the dialogue around decision making on new infrastructure. And this was accompanied by a political economy analysis and continued stakeholder engagement through action learning processes and capacity building to really not only validate the data and results going through, but to better understand how decisions are made and what this data and information means in this decision-making space. And currently, well, the project's just finished, but currently we're still closely working with the Pwalugu Steering Committee, which is the committee for the new proposed dam in this White Volta Basin area. So it's a very interesting study. Although it's research-based, it's directly being applied to a particular investment and infrastructure that will most likely be built in coming years. So in summary, just to say that natural infrastructure, as I said, needs to be recognized, quantified, invested in and managed at scale. I've been talking about basin scale throughout the presentation, and the benefits should not be limited to one group. The primary benefits create trade-offs. So therefore, the increased understanding of natural infrastructure and the interaction with built infrastructure is necessary to find what best combinations of solutions work, being context specific, based on what basin you're working in. And from the work and the results, we can see that clearly a combination of built and natural infrastructure provides the best range of solution investment portfolios for climate change and development. So thank you very much. There's some project information and website links for those interested to find out more.
That was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much for giving us that. I thought it was really interesting, and I had done some work in Ghana myself, so I totally understand the relationship between how the entire, I think one of the things maybe you could have talked, highlight, we could talk about how being able to influence the water governance in like the Volta River Basin has a huge impact on downstream communities such as Accra, the capital city of Ghana, who is dependent on all these waters and is dependent on having good sources of clean water to give to its citizens, even though a community like this is struggling to adequately provide water to all of its citizens in an equitable manner. I mean, it's hugely dependent on having a river basin that can provide this, and having those dams in place and not having them silt up and having them able to work with natural capital is truly important. So thank you so much for providing us that. Thank you. Our next presenter today is Lucy Lee. So Lucy, let me just give you control.
Great, thank you. Great. So yeah, I'm Lucy. I work at WWF UK on water stewardship, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about how water stewardship provides a framework for engaging business in sustainable water management. So initially looking at kind of what the challenges are for ecosystems and businesses, and that kind of provide the driver for our work, how stewardship provides that framework, and then a little bit on what we have done so far and how we're planning to scale up that activity both in the UK and globally. So the Living Planet index that we produce for freshwater showed that freshwater species abundance has declined by up to 81% between 1970 and 2012. And at the same time, you've got reports such as the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report citing, the risk that water poses to the economy. And we believe that the drivers of kind of the economic risk and the environmental risk are the same, and that's kind of the way that we're managing our water resources. And that means that we need to kind of come together to work collectively to address those shared water challenges. Within our water stewardship work, we recognise the kind of the impact of agriculture on freshwater biodiversity in terms of kind of, the level of over abstraction, and with up to kind of 70% of available freshwater used for agriculture, with the way that we're kind of, we're managing our land and the intensive farming and the way that's kind of degrading soils and causing it to run off into rivers and oceans, causing eutrophication, and the levels of kind of diffuse pollution. So yeah, I mean, I think nitrate levels in our global waterways have increased by 36% since 1990. And within the European context, we recognise that kind of 36% of failures to reach good ecological status under the Water Framework Directive are due to the agricultural sector. So a big kind of chunk of our water stewardship work is focused on the food and drink sector. We apply the kind of the water stewardship framework that we have developed. So it's a kind of a 5-step process. The first sort of 3 steps are very much focused on what a business can do internally, kind of assessing water risks across their portfolio, and looking at kind of reducing their operational kind of water use. But then because water risks arise because of the kind of cumulative water use in catchments, we recognise that kind of that internal water management won't be sufficient to manage the risks. So between steps 3 and 4 and 5, there's a shift from kind of internal water management to water stewardship. And a kind of individual business is unlikely to have the kind of influence at a catchment level to address those broad drivers of risk. So we see that it's important for businesses to come together with other stakeholders to work collectively, and that through their kind of economic and supply chain influence, they can really help to drive change. And ultimately, the aim is to kind of influence the policies that are governing how water is managed and how those are being implemented. And we play a kind of convening role in that process. And so our water stewardship work, when we're working with the food and drink sector, kind of supports improved farming practices and reduced water consumption. It kind of brings stakeholders together at that catchment level and scales up action by improving governance. And that obviously helps to kind of protect soils in the farming landscape, and has a knock-on impact then obviously on the freshwater environment, so supporting an improved river flow regime and the protection of freshwater estuarine and marine biodiversity. So in terms of what we have done so far, we have had a number of bilateral partnerships with companies. So we've worked with Marks and Spencer's for a number of years, and the first thing we did with them was to assess the water risks across their fresh produce supply chain using the water risk filter. And we identified a number of hotspots of risk, either from pollution or water scarcity, and the Western Cape was identified as a key one in the first phase of the partnership. So we started off a project with Marks and Spencer's and the South African retailer Woolworths and the Alliance for Water Stewardship in the Breed-Overberg catchment. That initially focused on the stone fruit farmers that had supply chain links to those retailers, and looked at what they could do on farm to improve their water efficiency. But it then recognised that these broader catchment level risks wouldn't be addressed by that, so it catalysed a broader kind of multi-stakeholder initiative to address those risks. So for example, it looked at clearing alien invasive species that are very water thirsty within the catchments, and looked at the pollution impact of informal settlements and how they could kind of work with those local communities to help improve that and reduce the impact of the pollution on the catchment. And then ultimately they looked at kind of what the lessons could be learned from that to improve the way that catchments were being managed, and then influence kind of national level policy. And in the UK, we've had a partnership with Coca-Cola for a number of years, which is looking to deliver kind of environmental improvements through collaborative working, and also to address the kind of reputational risks for Coca-Cola associated with diffuse pollution in their sugar supply chain. So this initially focused on an agricultural catchment in East Anglia, the River Nar, and a lot of the work was focused on engaging farmers to improve their farming practices, and we covered 2,000 acres of land in that first phase. We also supported the creation of a broader catchment plan to show how the ecological health of the river could be improved to meet the requirements under the Water Framework Directive. And a lot of the channels in that catchment have been artificially straightened. So we looked at how we could sort of re-meander a section of channel to take it back to its more natural form. And then building on that project, we secured EU LIFE funding for a broader project, which Coca-Cola match funded, and that was looking to drive change kind of across East Anglia, and looked at a couple of additional chalk stream catchments, the Cam Elyus and the Broadlands, and took the lessons from the initial work in the River Nar and kind of aimed to scale up across that regional level. And there's been a big kind of advocacy piece that sat alongside this work, looking at sort of policies and regulation in the UK and the changes that need to be made to that. So we did a lot of advocacy work around the 2014 water bill and the changes that were kind of needed to support the way water was being managed in the UK going forward. And we've done some assessment of the benefits that programme has delivered. So, for example, things like flood risk alleviation in terms of kind of slowing the flow of water within the catchments and reducing the kind of peak flood flow. And because there's less soil kind of running off the fields, reduced buildup of sedimentation as well, and the impact that then has on the aquatic habitat in terms of kind of limiting, obviously, the levels of fertilizer and pesticides that are running off into the river and creating a risk for algal blooms sedimentation deposit on the riverbed, which can interrupt with kind of fish spawning within the river. And within that, one of the catchments, the Camy-Lius, we're doing a natural capital assessment to sort of provide the evidence to farmers that implementing more water-sensitive farming practices will not adversely impact their business and ideally would increase profits. So we've done an initial phase of work that mapped the ecosystem services across that catchment and highlighted the key areas that were regulating the provision of services, which will help to kind of target interventions within that catchment in future. And we have kicked off a second phase of that work that is doing a more detailed analysis in sort of smaller sub-catchments or farm scale, looking at soil and water. So yeah, that phase is ongoing. And then we really wanted to kind of take the lessons from those sort of bilateral partnerships and look at how we could really scale up to sort of drive the level of change that is needed to meet water challenges. So we have been working with WRAP and the Rivers Trust in the UK to support the development of the Water Ambition, which has been launched today under the Courtauld Commitment 2025. So that's an industry-wide initiative for the UK food and drink sector led by WRAP. And it's the first kind of sector-wide water stewardship initiative of its type, involving kind of 95% of the retail sector in the UK, including manufacturers, trade bodies, and the hospitality sector. And a new water stewardship target has been brought in to sit alongside the operational water target. And that is looking to ensure that by 2025, all of the business signatories are participating in collective action to improve the quality and availability of water in key sourcing locations. So we've set a series of criteria for those projects to make sure that they will be focusing on kind of collective action beyond the fence line and advocacy. And the aim is ultimately to develop kind of self-sustaining groups of businesses in these key catchments so that those kind of risks can be addressed over the longer term. And mitigating for the company, the risk within their supply chain, for the broader stakeholders in the catchment, kind of supporting sustainable water management, and then locking all of that in through improving kind of policies and the way that they're implemented around water management. And we initially undertook some work with the signatories for them to use the water risk filter to map their risk across their supply chains. And we collected information back from them on their priority risk locations to look at where we had aligned hotspots of water risk across the signatories. So that initially identified a kind of a long list of companies that was narrowed down to Spain, South Africa and Kenya internationally, and then a number of catchments in the UK. And so we are going to be supporting the development of the international projects, and the Rivers Trust are leading the work in the UK. And as kind of part of that, the Rivers Trust have set up a water stewardship service supported by ourselves, Coca-Cola, Marks and Spencer's and Tesco's. And the aim of this is to really kind of catalyse and support businesses to come together and work with the 108 catchment partnerships to deliver sustainable solutions for water. And the aim is to kind of work in catchments where the risk has already been mapped and intervention scoped, so to enable business to kind of support those actions and deliver change at scale. And the service will cover the whole of the UK, but the Rivers Trusts are very local, so it's kind of providing that coverage, but also then tapping into local expertise. And the Rivers Trust are a kind of a national body that look to support the promotion and protection of the freshwater environment. They have 58 member trusts across the UK, and this slide just provides a summary of some of their key areas of delivery in 2016. So yeah, they're focusing very much on kind of engagement with farmers, and they've worked with over 900 or so farms, planting trees. So yeah, a huge number, 83,000 trees planted. And then, you know, what they can do in terms of creating wetlands, removing kind of fish barriers, and supporting kind of the improved environmental health of catchments and reducing the flood risk. And so, yeah, in the UK, the Courtauld Projects will be delivered by the Rivers Trust Water Stewardship Service. You can see the catchments that have been selected on the map. So these are all kind of subject to water stress, but are key sourcing locations for the UK food and drink sector. And in all of these, there's existing kind of initiatives that will be built on and supported. And the aim is really to demonstrate the benefits of that kind of collective action over the course of the projects, which are running until 2025. Yeah, in conclusion, the way that we're managing our soils and freshwater is obviously affecting our freshwater ecosystems and then having a knock-on impact on business and communities. We kind of work with businesses through our water stewardship approach to engage them and support sustainable water management within kind of catchments. And we've kind of taken sort of action with individual companies and are now kind of scaling that up through broader sector level action. And that's everything from me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. I thought that was really great. You know, I think that one thing the general public sometimes doesn't recognize, and I know a lot of people in the water industry do know, is how the really strong impact of agriculture on our water consumption. I mean, it's a level that's enormous, much more than I think a lot of people realize. So it's really great how you were able to connect to that and really focus on that sector, addressing, you know, the biggest user of water. But what I thought was really interesting was the ways that you were able to sort of work on a interscalar approach, because as you say, you know, farmers on their own individual actions, it's not really going to do that much. I mean, it's hard for them to kind of be linked together, but when you kind of bring it onto a catchment basis, a much broader scale, at which they're all kind of connected, all those farmers are connected in that catchment, but by able to do that, I think you really improve the impact of the work that you're doing. So I thought that was really great. Thank you so much.
No worries.
All right, our next presentation is Catherine Cross.
Yep. Okay, thank you, Scott. Just loading up my screen.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Catherine Cross. I'm a program manager for the International Water Association. I manage a program called Basins of the Future. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the actions that our members are taking in integrating nature from catchment to tap. So just a little bit about the IWRA. This is a membership organizations for water professionals across 130 countries from all sectors, including public, private, academia, international institutions, NGOs, and civil society. So the association aims to foster innovation in technology and practice to address urban and basin-related water challenges. So this graph gives an idea of who are our members, and you can see that we have a large majority of our corporate members are from water and wastewater utilities. So we have a strong focus on the urban and the utility part of water management. So something that we have released recently is the principles for water-wise cities. So what these principles do is that they aim to manage equitable universal access to safe water and sanitation. And the way that these principles are constructed are around 4 levels of action. So you can see in the diagram here that the first level of action is focusing on regenerative water services. So this is really looking at the water supply and treatment scale. The second level of action is at the city level. So this is looking at water-sensitive urban design. The third level of action is basin-connected cities. So how cities are connecting with their watersheds. And then the fourth level of action encompasses all of them, and it's around building water-wise communities. So what I'm going to be doing is exploring the integration of nature-based solutions at each level of action across the framework, and touching on how IWRA members are contributing towards that. So wetlands. So as we've heard, and some of the previous presentations will have focused more at the catchment level, but I'm going to start at the regenerative water services, which is again focusing on more water supply and sanitation. And so the vision here is to ensure public health and satisfy all current needs while protecting the quality and quantity of water resources. So here, this is using like wetlands because they function as natural filters. They support the removal of wastewater contaminants such as bacteria, heavy metals, and so on. Often, utilities might use constructed wetlands, might they integrate it into their infrastructure. And you can do the same thing with domestic and industrial wastewater and sewage. And there are co-benefits of having such natural and constructed wetlands as part of your sanitation services. For example, it can create a green oasis in the city, which could provide leisure opportunities, livelihoods. It can also help with mitigating urban heat islands and provide habitat for wildlife. So what is IWRA doing to integrate nature? So the association has a number of specialist groups, and one of them is the Wetland Systems for Water Pollution Control. And this particular group is exploring innovative applications using wetlands to improve water quality. So here you'll see a couple of the publications that they've put out on treatment wetlands and natural wastewater treatment systems. And then secondly, with the Nature Conservancy and a number of our members, we have a working group called focusing on sanitation for and by nature. And this essentially is developing guidance to help wastewater utilities and regulators implement nature-based sanitation solutions. So this could be constructed wetlands, for example, natural wetlands, into wastewater treatment facilities, but at the same time doing this in a way that provides benefits to nature and encourages biodiversity. So this guidance is going to provide evidence-based practices and technical criteria to help wastewater utilities and regulators integrate nature-based solutions into their operation and maintenance of their sanitation services. So the second level of action is on water-sensitive urban design. So the vision here is about integrating the integration of urban planning with the management, protection, and conservation of the total urban water cycle, so that we build the city so that it's not we build the city around water rather than just covering up all the waterways. So one of the things that is being done is that communities are increasingly looking to integrate nature into their infrastructure at the city level, and this could be through greening buildings, permeable paving, urban parks, safe flooding spaces for waterways. And having this helps reconnect people to water, and they see it as an asset rather than a dirty nuisance, which can be in some cases. There's in South Korea, 59 cities have announced regulations and commitment to become rain cities. So what they're doing is that they're offering financial incentives for rainwater management systems, or they're helping to subsidize them. Another example of rainwater is in Singapore, and here it's collected in tanks and used for toilet flushing. So this helps reduce water consumption, because water is such a big issue in Singapore, but also helps save on energy and reduce other costs. So what is IWRA doing to integrate nature? Well, we have a couple of specialist groups that look at this. So we have a specialist group that is on urban drainage, and they foster and conduct research on urban drainage, and this includes how green urban infrastructure can reduce the impacts of climate variability and change, so due to flooding or water scarcity. We also have another specialist group that focuses on rainwater harvesting and management, and in this publication here, they explore how to transform from a drain city to a rain city. So looking at how to design multi-purpose micro-catchment that enable rainwater management. And then finally, my colleagues in China are brokering knowledge from member expertise to develop sponge cities, which build on these concepts. The third level of action is around basin-connected cities. And the vision here is for cities to take part in basin management, because they need to secure water, food, and energy resources, they need to protect water quality, and they have to increase their resilience to extreme events. So we know 172 million people live in the 100 largest cities, and their water comes from watersheds, which are more than 50% cropland. And consequently, land practices have a huge impact on this, and poor land practices can increase runoff and affect the quality of water, which the cities rely on. In fact, utilities, for every 10% increase in forest cover in their source water area, it's been found that chemical and treatment costs decrease by 20%. So you can see here that if you have a disruption in your supply of freshwater resources, then this has significant economic, environmental, and health consequences on the populations in the cities. But cities are taking action, for example, through payments for ecosystem programs such as the Eco Compensation Scheme in China and the Latin America Water Funds Partnership, which TNC has been working on quite heavily. So what is IWRA doing? So again, we have some specialist groups that work on this area. We have one that's looking at diffuse pollution and specifically how to use green technology, natural retention, and land management as a way to tackle contamination of downstream water resources. Another thing is that stemming from these principles for water-wise cities, we're developing a basin, I would say basin city action agenda, which aims to influence and activate urban stakeholders to take a more active role in protecting and investing in their catchment with basin organization. And so this agenda provides a framework for showcasing best practices. We have a number of basin stories that are aimed to inspire cities and their stakeholders to be aware and respond to what is happening in the watershed. So essentially looking at how cities and urban stakeholders, what the actions are that they can take today to achieve sustainable management into the future. So this is just a snapshot of the different pathways that cities can take to become agents of change in their catchment area. And of course, this includes the integration of nature-based solutions. Then the final level of action is building water-wise communities. So this is about professionals becoming more water-wise in their areas of expertise, but also citizens themselves becoming more water-wise in their behavior, so that everyone is responsible and has a role to play. So in order to manage current and future water challenges, this cannot be undertaken by individual entities such as utilities or city governments, but they really need to engage and work with stakeholders across the catchment they rely on for water resources. Also looking at the regulators' perspective, they can play a key role in encouraging active application of nature-based solutions from catchment to city to utility to the individual consumer. So for example, in Peru, the National Water Regulator, they're working with utilities to use the service fees to invest in catchment areas. So in terms of what IWRA is doing, we have an International Water Regulators Forum, and this is being used to support regulators to think about how nature-based solutions can be incorporated for improved water security and safety. And we're actually exploring a joint task force with the Nature Conservancy to go into more depth on that and really activate this regulator network to be advocates. Another thing that we're doing is encouraging participants at the events that we attend or that we hold to reflect on how they actually personally take action to support the transition to water-wise cities. So we have these personal action cards. So I'm here at the World's Water Forum and we're leading the urban theme. So throughout our sessions here, we've been asking people to fill these out. And then finally, it's around building capacity, especially among the pipes and pumps water professionals, which part of our constituency is that, and get them to think about how to consider nature as a solution. So it's about influencing them. We're exploring partnerships to disseminate training, and then through learning events, workshops, and webinars such as this. So just to conclude, you can find out more what IWRA partners and members are doing to achieve nature-based solutions. We actually have a webinar series, and we had the first one on March 10th, and this was looking at the catchment level, and we had New York City, and we had a presentation on the water funds from the Nature Conservancy. And then our next webinar is actually at the beginning of April 10th, and this is focusing on green infrastructure for water-wise cities. And then the final one would be looking at the water and sanitation services. So this is in May. And then also this year we have our World Water Congress and exhibition in Tokyo in September, and we'll have some workshops on nature solutions, especially looking at this engineering aspect. And we'll be launching the Basin Action Agenda, which I mentioned earlier on. So thank you. That's it for me.
Hey, Catherine, thank you so much for that presentation. That was really great. You know, and I think that as a lot of us know, the percentage of the world's population who are going to be living in urban centers is rapidly increasing, and will continue to do so into the future. So it's really important to be able to address the water issues of these urban residents. You know, and I think a lot of people kind of naturally divorce the urban land form from the more natural based. They say, okay, well, I know what a forest is, and the forest isn't in the city, or maybe they think of it as just a park. But as you really highlighted, I think there's so many different ways that people can really interact with nature in their city, and they can build these natural based solutions into the urban core. So I think that was a really great presentation, and I really appreciate that. Thank you. And I think, Catherine, if you have to leave, you'd mentioned you were leaving early, so go ahead and leave when you need to. But our next presenter will be Carrie.
Great, thanks so much. Scott, can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Great, okay, I'll get started then. So it's great to be part of this panel. I think that a lot of our presentations are connected, which is great, and I'll be able to build on some of what's already been presented about using nature as a solution for addressing water challenges. What I'm going to focus on for my talk is around some of the other kinds of benefits we can bring about for when we implement nature-based solutions for water security challenges. So, and I'm going to focus on source water protection, and when I'm talking about that here, I think there's different connotations of what that means. And what I'm focusing on is when we invest in nature-based solutions in the watershed that help maximize freshwater ecosystem services for downstream water security. So source water protection can consist of a variety of kinds of activities, including protection activities, restoration activities, best management practices, even fire risk management, and other kinds of activities that aim to maximize these freshwater ecosystem services. So a couple of years ago, we embarked on a journey to understand what those other kinds of benefits might be for source water protection activities. The primary outcome we're going for with these kinds of activities is water security outcomes, such as improved or sustained water quality, in some cases some water quantity benefits. But as we were implementing these projects around the globe, we were seeing that as we implement nature-based solutions, we could address some of the other kinds of major global challenges that we're facing, including challenges around climate change, around health and well-being, and also, of course, ecosystems and biodiversity, which is a primary interest for the Nature Conservancy. So we spent about a year and a half with a big group of researchers from inside TNC as well as external to TNC, exploring the potential of these what we called co-benefits for source water protection. And we encapsulated this work into a big report called Beyond the Source. I encourage you to explore this report to learn more, but I'll present a little bit of this, what our findings were today. So the first thing that we did, and many of you who worked in understanding the connection between cities and where they get the water from, one of the big missing pieces is a global map of cities and their watersheds. So we spent the first bit of time working with McGill University, taking our using some algorithms to take our best guess at where the source watersheds were for 4,000 cities of 100,000 people or more. What we found when we mapped these is that this would cover almost 2 billion urban dwellers, and the source watersheds for these cities covered more than 37% of the Earth's ice-free surface. So we were already seeing that these source watersheds are a really important part of, they are an important part of the global map, and what we're doing in these source watersheds and towards helping with water security for cities, as you can imagine, that given the landmass here, that there's a lot of opportunity for thinking about other kinds of outcomes. So the co-benefits that we considered here included obviously the primary benefit of water security, but then also opportunities to help with climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, a whole suite of human health and well-being outcomes that we explored, and what the potential could be for biodiversity conservation. So I'm just going to click through some of the findings that we had in each of these categories. And what we're looking at here is we looked at three different, as you saw, there was a whole variety of source water protection activities that you could implement. For this study, we looked at just 3 of those. And we looked at them across these source watersheds that we had mapped. So, for example, around water security, we found that actually 4 out of 5 cities that we mapped can reduce sediment and nutrient pollution by a meaningful amount by using these 3 activities, which was forest protection, pasture land, reforestation, and agricultural best management practices in terms of cover crops. We also found that by taking care of the land in our urban source watersheds through these activities, we could, in terms of using nature to capture carbon, we found that we could get 16% of the way to the 2050 carbon reduction goal under the Paris Agreement. So as our climate change team has been working on for many years, nature is a really important component of reaching that the goals set out in the Paris Agreement, and we were able to demonstrate in the in urban source watersheds that this is an important part of the story. We also looked at a variety of climate change impacts and how and the relationship between these source watersheds and these activities with those climate change impacts. So, for example, we found that about 1/4 of these urban source watersheds are likely to experience an increase in forest fires. And as you saw in the set of activities, forest fire risk reduction is one of the activities that we can use to both have water security outcomes, but also reduce all the other impacts of forest fires. Also, a majority of these source watersheds are likely to experience an increase in soil erosion, and many of the source water protection activities can reduce soil erosion, which has water security benefits, but also has many other kinds of benefits. In terms of human health and well-being, as I mentioned, we looked at a lot of different connections between source water protection activities and human health and well-being outcomes. Just one of these that we focused on was around the connection with pollinators. These source water protection activities that we're implementing can help maintain natural pollinators. And we found that without these pollinators in these urban source watersheds, we would see a 10% decrease in micronutrients available through locally produced food, and that across these source watersheds, that global agricultural production could decline by as much as 5%. So there's a really important connection here between protecting nature and maintain these natural pollinators and the outcomes for health through micronutrients, and as well economically through agricultural production. And finally, as we looked across these source watersheds, we found that they're really important places for different kinds of species, including those that are facing possible extinction. So we saw that restoring the lands of these source watersheds could help reduce global extinction of 52 species, and on a regional level, we could help in preventing regional extinctions for many more animal species. So what's also really interesting is what this means for investment in these kinds of solutions. So we've done work before on the possible return on investment for water security outcomes. So for a utility who may decide to invest in source water protection as part of their water security strategy, we've mapped previously how many cities might have a positive return on investment where the cost of the nature-based solutions would be less than the positive return in terms of reduced treatment costs because of the reduction in sediment and nutrients. So what's really interesting about looking at the potential of multiple benefits is that in places where that return on investment might not be as high, if we bring in these other kinds of outcomes around, carbon sequestration and human health and well-being and some possible economic outcomes in the watershed, that total return investment is increased, and we may think about, as we're thinking about how to implement these solutions, it may not be that just the downstream water users will want to invest in these kinds of solutions, but that we could think about a suite of actors who are interested in different kinds of outcomes, who are interested in investing in these nature-based solutions. We also did a broad study of what this might look like for one country, and so we focused in on Colombia, and our partners in the Natural Capital Project did this part of the study, where we Colombia has set a lot of commitments related to the SDGs, and they, including water security outcomes and biodiversity outcomes and carbon commitments. So we wanted to see what it would look like if we looked at multiple watersheds in Colombia, and not just focused on the water security outcomes, but looked at multiple outcomes and how that might how we might be able to meet multiple outcomes at once in a given watershed. So what we found was, for these 6 watersheds in Colombia, we found that there were reduced costs for multi-objective planning, and those multiple objectives included nutrient reduction, sediment reduction, and carbon sequestration outcomes. And this varied across the watershed, so from 13% to 95% in terms of reduced costs. And we also ran a base flow model and found that we didn't use this to optimize the activities, but we found that by implementing these activities towards these other outcomes, we found an increase in base flow in these watersheds with a range from between 2% and 10%. So, as you can see, I think the potential for these different kinds of outcomes for source water protection is pretty exciting. And the Nature Conservancy has been implementing source water protection for quite some time now. And you know, when we think about it, this study we did was looking at the global potential for these kinds of outcomes. And so we really have a high ambition about, you know, being able to implement source water protection at scale across the globe. And one of the ways we're doing that is through our water funds framework. And so water funds basically provides a governance and financing mechanism to implement these source water protection programs. And this is all done with a strong foundation of science for planning and implementation, as well as sometimes one of the hardest parts about these projects is doing the implementation on the ground, connecting with communities in these watersheds and making these activities actually happen on the ground. So, so water funds provides this whole framework of being able to achieve these source water protection activities. And so we started water funds in the year 2000, the first one in Quito, Ecuador, and we now have 30 water funds across the globe, with 30 more in design, and with plans to scale up water funds across the globe, with you know, TNC implementing, continuing to implement water funds with its partners, but then also building capacity for others to implement water funds in order to maximize the potential of implementing nature-based solutions for water security for cities. So I'll just finish with an example of a water fund, which tracks a few of these co-benefits. So this water fund is in the Upper Tana, Nairobi. It's the Upper Tana Nairobi Water Fund, and the main objective here was to reduce the amount of sediment that was coming into the Tana River, because Nairobi Sewage and Water Company was experiencing at certain times of year, they were having to shut down the system or spend a lot of money cleaning out the system in order to meet the water needs because of these the excess sediment in the incoming water. As well as it was having impacts on the hydropower industry in terms of loading of sediment in the reservoirs and reducing the lifespan of the reservoirs for the hydropower. So we engaged with a number of actors, including the water company, including hydropower companies, as well as the Water Resource Management Authority and local WRMAs, Water Resource water catchment groups, and some nonprofits are already working in the basin, including the Greenbelt movement, who was focused on planting trees in the basin, and a private agricultural company who was already working with tens of thousands of farmers in the upper part of the watershed. And the kinds of activities we've implemented here include tree planting, but there's a big focus on working with smallholder farmers on improving practices to reduce sediment that's running off into the rivers, as well as helping them increase their productivity on their land. So the kinds of things that we're tracking here include the water security benefits, such as you know, the reduced turbidity in the river, which was the primary water security outcome that that kind of pushed this forward. But we're also tracking livelihood benefits to the people we're working with in the watershed. We're tracking carbon sequestration, and we're tracking biodiversity and ecosystem benefits of this project. So thanks so much. I look forward to the discussion, and yeah, if anybody has any questions, specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. Feel free to email me.
Sure, thank you so much for that presentation. I thought it was really, really interesting. You know, it was kind of like with Catherine's, where you're, you know, both focusing on impacts of nature-based solutions on urban areas. But I thought, you know, how what I really focused on and found was particularly interesting with you was the impact of the water funds and how these kind of, you know, you kind of create these sort of co-planning, co-created projects with people who are impacted and who are implementing these nature-based solutions on the ground to kind of create a sort of a socio-economic, socio-ecological project. I thought that was really interesting. Thank you so much. Our final presentation of the day is from David Coates, and I'll remind everybody that you can ask questions on the box on the about halfway down on your GoToWebinar control panel. So it says questions, and you can just type a question and it'll come right to me. And then at the end of David's presentation, we'll try to give a couple time for a few questions. So thank you very much. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My computer's telling me I have slow internet, so if I start breaking up, people please tell me and I'll try and do something about it. Can you hear okay?
Yeah, I can hear just fine. You sound great.
Okay, right. When IWRA approached me asking me if I wanted to be involved in the webcam, of course I was quite keen, and then they asked me what am I going to talk about. And I've been involved with nature-based solutions for many years. Previously, when I worked with Secretariat at the Convention on Biological Diversity based in Montreal, and we worked extensively with all of the organisations, the previous presenters actually, to develop this this concept. And it's the topic of World Water Day today, and also the topic of the latest World Water Development Report, which is on nature-based solutions, which by the compulsory reading for everybody. And I forgot to put it on my PowerPoint presentation, but you should Google World Water Development Report 2018. So what I'm going to say is basically a snapshot of this topic, and the details can be found in that report. Now, why choose agriculture? A number of reasons. The first is that the agriculture water security dialogue tends to be dominated very much by irrigation. And I got a bit fed up of this. So I think we need to start talking about beyond irrigation. It's also probably, I would say probably the most important in terms of opportunities for the deployment of nature-based solutions. And I'll give some examples later. And also to make the point that this business of nature-based solutions is not just about managing natural systems. There are great opportunities to be had in managing in nature-based solutions in managed systems, and agriculture is a classic example. All farmland is a managed ecosystem. The other opportunity, of course, is within urban settings, which has been mentioned already. So I believe this is an extremely important topic, and I'll try and explain why. I'm going to tell you about the role of soils and land cover. This is another thing, that the discussions of nature-based solutions tend to be dominated by discussions of forests and wetlands. These are important. There's less discussion about the role of vegetation as such, and in particular the role of soils in water cycling. I'm going to talk about the impacts of conventional agricultural intensification and the prospects for agriculture and water using nature-based solutions, give an example of that, and then try and frame this in the context of how can nature-based solutions in agriculture contribute towards the solving this so-called world, the water crisis that we're all facing. Now, there on the right-hand side of the screen is a schematic of basically trying to explain how ecosystems are involved in water cycling across landscapes. And we want to focus really on the top right-hand part of it, which is this, which is looking at that critical layer on the surface of land, which is normally covered by plants. And then there's a soil on top of it, on all these little arrows. We don't have time to go into this, but basically most water that falls on land, the fate of that water is determined by the nature and the condition of that top layer of land there. Agriculture is deliberately changing the nature of that vegetation. It swaps forests, for example, for food crops, and disturbs the surface layer there through tillage and planting of crops, etc. And agriculture also is the dominant land use category, accounting for something like 35% now of global land area, excluding the ice-covered areas. So it is a major determinant of water cycling. This is a schematic here of the top 6 inches, and really we are talking about the critical area is the top 6 inches. And then in a natural system, that top 6 inches of soil is full of all wonderful creatures. Some of them are not particularly attractive, but they're all doing wonderful things of keeping the soil going as a healthy ecosystem. And the critical layer is a very thin layer at the top there of organic litter in a natural system, and modern agriculture removes that and removes the plants and disturbs that soil. I'll come on to this shortly. But this ecosystem is performing lots of very critical functions. One is water regulation. The two other important ones are nutrient cycling and carbon cycling as well. So we've got nutrient cycling going on there and carbon cycling going on in a natural system. Modern tillage agriculture essentially completely destroys the nature of that top layer of soil. As you can see in that, that photograph there, doing that once or twice a year completely disrupts that top soil as an ecosystem, and exposing, in particular, exposing soil like that, bare soil, increases erosion significantly, both water erosion and wind erosion. So basically over time, the soil disappears, and often most of the time it's disappearing into rivers and lakes and downstream into coastal areas and silting up dams, etc. Those of you who have a nervous disposition, I do get a little bit more positive later on in my talk, but basically the current situation with agriculture is regarded as unsustainable. It's not me saying that, it's the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, is saying that. And the main problem is in most of what you might call modern agricultural approaches, excessive tillage, and that tends to be associated with the excessive chemical use, unsustainable water demand, loss of soil biodiversity, soil carbon, and soil erosion. And some examples of impacts, these are at global scale. Soil erosion is a big worldwide problem. 25 to 40 billion tons of topsoil loss every year. Why is this important? Well, first of all, that's where we grow crops. Secondly, now soil is an ecosystem service. Actually, it takes between 100 and 1,000 years to produce soil. So basically, under the life, under the time span of the average life expectancy of us as people, essentially we start losing topsoil. It's basically unsustainable. This reduces crop yields, leads to all kinds of problems downstream, and in addition, it transports huge quantities of nitrogen and phosphorus offland and contributes to water pollution. These points have been made, of course, by previous speakers already. Inefficient water use, and approximately 70% of agricultural lands are considered to be degraded to some degree. Figures vary depending on definitions, but something like 30% of agricultural land is now considered to be highly degraded. The global loss of soil organic carbon is huge. It's a major, has historically been a major contributor to greenhouse gas increases in the atmosphere. And it also, loss of soil carbon undermines crop water availability. It's a major determinant of the amount of water that can be stored. So losing carbon from soils is bad news. Agriculture generally is the main driver of forest loss worldwide. It's a leading cause of land degradation, desertification and drought. You hear stories in Africa, for example, of droughts due to climate change, not the case. Reason for drought and desertification in Africa is land degradation caused by human activity, and it's mainly through agricultural use, including livestock use. And I used to work with CBD, and nice interesting factoid there at the end. That we did a report was produced in 2014 showing that when you look at the projection of biodiversity loss by 2050 and look at the drivers of that biodiversity loss, agriculture or food production is responsible for 70% of the loss of biodiversity by 2050, terrestrial biodiversity, and 50% loss from fresh waters. So it's a big problem. Agriculture also accounts for about global figure about 70% of global water withdrawals. So it's the major user of water, major source of water pollution, and is linked to increasing disaster risks, including floods and droughts. An example there of nutrient loading as such is now probably the most prevalent water quality challenge that we have. It varies a little bit from region to region, but overall in the world, our biggest problem is with controlling nutrient loading in fresh water. And agriculture is the single largest source of anthropogenic nutrients going into water. Figures there showing the relative contribution of nitrates and phosphates from agriculture in OECD countries. We don't have figures for outside OECD, but it's a similar situation in those areas. This is a scary map. This is climate change projections done, and it's looking at reductions in soil moisture up to 2050 in the top 10 centimeters, the top 4 inches of soils. And basically anything that's yellow, orange, or even worse, red, is where soils are going to get drier, and in green, blue, dark blue, they're going to get a bit wetter. But essentially, you live in any of those areas that are yellow or red, it's bad news, because if you reduce soil moisture content, you are reducing crop productivity, because plants require soil moisture in order to grow. So basically it's bad news. The good news is, I mean, the implications of that graphic essentially are that what we need to be doing, one of the things that we need to be doing in order of responding to climate change or adapting to it, is to improve how well soils can store water, which we should come on to shortly. Prospects, we need, depending on which figures you quote, we need something like 60% more food needs to be produced. How is that going to be done when we already know that the business as usual model of agriculture is unsustainable? And to point out that reducing intensification, in other words, by converting agriculture, moving it away from this high intensive input systems to more extensive, lower impact agriculture is simply not an option, because we do not have the land to be able to do that. That requires vastly increased quantities of land. We'll lose all the forests, we'll lose national parks, and actually there isn't enough land anyway to be able to do that. However, there is a broad consensus amongst policymakers and most organisations dealing with agriculture and environment that we do need to further intensify agricultural production, but it needs to be now based on rebuilding the ecological foundation of farming, what's referred to by the agriculture community as ecological intensification of production. Basically, in a scientific sense, to restore ecosystem services required to support sustainable production increases and reduce environmental externalities. In our terminology today, this means essentially that the solution for solving food security, water security related issues with agriculture is essentially to apply nature-based solutions. An example of nature-based approaches would be conservation agriculture. I'll show you a slide in a minute of what that means. And essentially, it's an approach which restores natural soil functionality through minimum or no tillage. Don't destroy the upper 6 inches of the land. Maintain the organic soil cover, either through mulching or the cover crops. That protects the soil against erosion from rain and also enables rainfall to enter the soil more appropriately and stay there, and improve the diversity of and rotate crops, using leguminous crops to replenish nitrogen instead of artificial fertilizers, and results in improved water regulation, reduced water demand, increased soil water moisture, increased soil organic carbon, etc. Reduces soil erosion, restores biodiversity. All sounds wonderful. The important thing is that it also increases crop productivity, which is an essential component of any approach to improving sustainability in agriculture. Has to improve agricultural productivity, because that translates into improved farmers' incomes. Unless farmers benefit financially or through livelihoods through approaches that are recommended, it's going to be a struggle to actually get them to do it. But in the case of these kinds of approaches, it can be shown that not only do you get the environmental benefits, but you can actually also improve farmers' livelihoods and improve sustainability and resilience. An example here of the photograph, this is the same field, happens to be in Switzerland, On the right-hand side is a field that is under conventional tillage agriculture, and on the left-hand side is the same field, half of the field that is under conservation agriculture, and this is immediately after a thunderstorm. And you can see on the right-hand side the water is pooling on the surface. On the left-hand side, less so, much less so. Now, the important thing here is the right-hand side. This is not where we want the water to be after it's rained. That water there, if it was in a hot environment, would be evaporating quickly. It will be lost. If there's any kind of slope on that field, it would drain off. It would increase flooding downstream. And most importantly, from a farming perspective, that water is not available to plants. It's not going to be contributing to plant production in that field. On the left-hand side, the water is maintained in the surface layers. It enters through into the soils because we've got lots of biodiversity there, creating lots of channels, etc., and things for the water to go into the soil and to stay then to be available for crop production. Now, what's the potential for nature-based solution to contribute to addressing water resources management challenges? And a lot of work's been done on this. And for example, there's a lot of research done on looking at how much water benefit can we do by simply improving land and soil management in rain-fed systems, and using quite conservative estimates of improvements that can be made, which I believe are about 20% in terms of productivity. It translates into a water benefit of 1,600 cubic kilometers of water use globally. Now, the significance of that figure is that that equates to about 35% of current water withdrawals. And it's importantly, it's in excess of the requirements for increased water demand, the projections of future water demand by 2050. So basically, the message here is that we're talking about this water crisis. To a large extent, this water crisis is entirely man-made. And in looking at global figures, you can actually get out of this crisis simply by improving the management of soils and vegetation cover in farming systems. It's not quite that simple because there are regional differences in the scope for doing this. And although technically it's a simple approach, there are some constraints to actually doing this. But the message is basically that there are solutions here, large-scale solutions for addressing the problems that we have with water globally. This kind of approach is also a major response to climate-proof agriculture, and it's a major means to address water quality and both nutrients and soil erosion, major benefits across the Sustainable Development Goals. It's multifunctional. Not only we're talking about sustainable water, but also major contributions to poverty reduction and livelihoods. The reason why that's important, because actually most farmers, most small-scale farmers in developing countries, resource-poor farmers, families, actually depend on rain-fed agriculture, not irrigated agriculture, and delivers substantial environmental and biodiversity benefits. So the way forward here, and I've only given a snapshot here of nature-based solutions, there are many more kinds of approaches that qualify as nature-based solutions. There are many examples, for example, of the way in which nature-based solutions can improve irrigation water use as well. It's not just about rain-fed systems. But I think the way forward, we need to shift from viewing agriculture as a problem and to seeing agriculture as a solution. Because of the dominance of agriculture in the landscape and the dominance of agriculture on water resources, and to a large extent the fact that water use in agriculture at the moment overall is quite inefficient, this presents several significant opportunities. So agriculture is a solution in the way forward, not so much a problem. And sustainability is well within reach. We know how to do this, and it's less of a technical problem. And the solution really is to applying these kinds of approaches at scale. And I'd say the same thing for most nature-based solutions, actually. It's more to do with creating the right enabling conditions for the nature-based solutions to take off on their own. And the good news in all of this is what I'm saying here, that the agriculture sector itself is leading the way on innovations and solutions to water security. And I find that quite encouraging for all of these, addressing all of these challenges, and for implementing nature-based solutions to address them. We need the sectors on board. And I find it quite encouraging that it's, when you look at what's happening out there, it's actually the agriculture sector itself that's realized the problem and is busy there getting on with trying to implement solutions for it. And I find that, and assisted in many cases by the environment agencies and sector, but it's largely an agriculture sector driven approach is this. So I find that really quite encouraging. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I thought that was a really great presentation. You know, one of the things I thought you well addressed there was the ways that so often we kind of think of agriculture as like, you know, there's only one way to do it. You know, we're already doing the state of the art, and the state of the art would be, you know, with a tilling and all that. But I thought, you know, the way you approached and you showed with the slides and everything, you know, there's a lot of different ways to simply not do that, you know, with no-till agriculture. And there's a lot of other options that are out there. I know follow work done with you know, more polycultures and perennials being planted rather than with you know, we're using annuals where we're just kind of doing heavily intensive farming each and every year. Okay, folks. Well, we are, as you can tell, right about at the end of what should be the webinar. But if we can just hold on for a little bit, we could do a couple of quick questions. And if anyone on the panel has to run off, I totally understand, and that'd be. But if we can just do a question or two, it'd be good. I like to get that kind of community interaction. I think that's really important. You know, I think that one of the things that some of our questions are bringing up, and I should mention that all of our participants' slides will be available on our website here in the next week. I'll ask them to send them to me, and we'll post them on the website. So if any of you want to review some of the slides and the presentations, you can go ahead and do so. But I think one of the things that some of our questions are bringing up is the way that a lot of these nature-based solutions, although we're talking about best practices or we're talking about ideal ways to do things, I mean, they're all based on some very context-specific implementations. So one of our people who kind of mentioned, one of the questions kind of mentioned ways that from the basin in Mexico City and the need to reduce the size of the urban footprint completely, which is maybe not necessarily a nature-based solution, but the way to keep that nature-based constraints, since obviously, as many of you know, the size of the urban core in Mexico City is vastly growing and using far too much of their aquifer. But here's a question that says that could, kind of questioning what are these nature-based solutions, could decentralized and small footprint municipal wastewater treatment systems such as membrane biological reactors, technical perhaps, be considered as nature-based solutions, as they can play an intermediary role between supplying and cleaning effluent and water-intensive infrastructure such as vertical gardens, green areas, urban drainage systems, etc. Do you have any thoughts about this? Does anyone have some thoughts about ways that, you know, different structures can act as intermediary steps?
If it's okay, Scott, I'll jump in. I'm working with Catherine on that project she mentioned, which is nature sanitation for and by nature. So that's one of the things we're going to be exploring. I guess it depends how you categorize things. You know, it may not be necessarily what I'd call a nature-based solution, but I think the interactions between the gray and the green is really important. So one thing we're looking at in that project is how some of the gray solutions can have benefits to nature, and again, how nature might be integrated into sanitation as a complement or replacement for gray infrastructure. So, so in my mind, that wouldn't be exactly a nature-based solution, but it would be something that could benefit nature. And I think it's just as important to link the gray and the green together, and that's something we're going to be exploring specifically in sanitation through that SNAP project that Catherine mentioned. Awesome,
that's great. Well, thank you. Let me try to pull up a next question here. Well, here's something that people are asking. You know, from all of you have different context-based implementations of the projects that you're working on, but how much evidence, or how much, can you talk about how the evidence-based data is changing the ways that decisions are made?
I can mention that if you like, because the World Water Development Report goes into this topic of evidence for nature-based solutions, and there is a little bit of a debate in the scientific community about the evidence, actually. Although, as I say, that debate is slowly being won, and the evidence for nature-based solutions is, to some extent, is based on largely on practice, and we certainly have the practice there. But it is the case that there are many generalized assumptions, in some cases myths actually, about the way in which ecosystems work. And there are indeed a lot of applications of nature-based solutions that are not rigorously assessed and tested. And I think that we need to do more of that. As a generalized statement, nature-based solutions, it's a good idea, can be cost-effective, but there are exceptions. For example, you have to be very careful with wetlands. This idea that wetlands mitigate floods, it depends where your wetland is, what kind of wetland it is. Some wetlands actually increase flood risks. The impact of forests, for example, the impact of forests on water quality is well established, but the impacts of forests on water cycling are quite conjectural in the scientific community. So you need to be careful on a case-by-case basis. And one of the conclusions that we came to when we did a scientific assessment of the whole field is that essentially we do feel we have a very strong scientific base, but we need to be careful now that we put more attention into more rigorous assessments of deployment and nature-based solutions and come up with more evidence of impacts on hydrology and impacts on economics as well, because we do feel that we have got the world's attention now on nature-based solutions. There's a lot more attention to this topic now than there was 10 years ago. And we need to be careful that we don't undermine that attention by more examples of nature-based solutions that are not well founded in science and are not rigorously assessed. We need quality control across the board on what we're doing with this. Otherwise, we'll lose the initiative on this topic.
That's an interesting observation. Does anyone else have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would second that. I think we haven't it has been a gap in the past, the kind of evidence, and it was interesting to see across the presentations that there was a focus on kind of building that up and providing it. I do think that's really needed if we're going to shift certainly the kind of engineering sector away from just always considering kind of grey infrastructure and see the opportunities potentially in more natural solutions. So yeah, I think it's an area that is really important and yeah, will help to make that business case for nature-based solutions in future.
Rebecca, I think your mute is on.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. No, I'd just like to jump in and say I completely agree. And I think one thing that, we're more aware of monitoring and costs related to performance and risks for built infrastructure, but not for I talked about natural infrastructure, but generally for MBS. And I think that this is something that we are building steady evidence on, but we need more to convince more people. I mean, ultimately, when you're looking at investments and large-scale investments, you're up against grounded information around built infrastructure that's known around performance and maintenance and impacts and risk. And these are all areas of data that we are trying to slowly build up, but are still needed more work on.
Scott, I think, are you on mute now?
Scott, we can't hear you. I think
Yeah,
you're on mute.
I realized. I just realized that. Sorry. No, Carrie, were you going to say something? I'm sorry. I didn't.
Oh no, I think everyone. I agree with what everyone's saying, and part of it is building an evidence case, but then being able to translate it into a language that makes sense to those decision makers. I think sometimes, you know, we work in one world, and we've worked in the kind of like the, for example, conservation world, and then there's sort of like the engineering, the policy decision makers, and others who are making decisions about these kinds of green versus gray. And I think being able to put it in the same context in terms of like comparable numbers and even just the language has been a challenge. I think we're getting better, but we need to work on that. Continue to work on that as we build the evidence base.
That's a really good point. I think so many of us that work in the water sector, one of the things we enjoy, at least I do, is that it provides a really great opportunity for interdisciplinary work. I mean, all the opportunities are right there. But you're right. I mean, even within us who try to do this a lot, it can be so hard to bridge those kind of vocabularies and just make things clear. I mean, make the perspective important. It's very interesting how different disciplines can maybe kind of understand the same thing, but understand it from completely different approaches, and sometimes end up with very different results. It can be kind of hard to communicate in between. So, okay, well, I guess this is if we can just kind of, if everyone wants to do a quick summary of maybe any last thoughts they have, we can just kind of go around from top to bottom. David, do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, just say that the subject of nature-based solutions, and if you like, green versus green infrastructure, we need to break down these barriers. It's not a case of which is better. It's a case of how do you use what's available there for achieving optimal benefits of management of systems. And in many cases, a lot of the examples of good deployment of nature-based solutions are actually where it's improved the efficiency of grey infrastructure. So this argument, which is waning actually, between is green or grey better, is a bit of a false dichotomy. I feel there are examples of where nature-based solutions is probably the only feasible way forward, and I would quote my example there in agriculture, and I would say combating desertification is another one. There are examples where you need grey, you do need large dams in some places, but it's extremely difficult to come up with an example of where you've got grey working on its own. Grey infrastructure always works in the context of existing green infrastructure. It's the green infrastructure that supplies water to the grey. So what we need is a balanced and impartial view of approaching the subject, of looking at the options for green, options for grey, fair, robust scientific assessments of both of those scenarios, and adopting the most feasible solution. The big problem with nature-based solutions, as is reported in the report I referred to, is that the problem that there is an overwhelming bias to using grey infrastructure, and that's a problem. And the bias towards grey infrastructure means essentially that there's a bias against green. And we do need to break down these barriers and have a much more holistic approach to how we manage water that makes the best of both approaches in an integrated fashion. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was good perspective. Rebecca, you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. David has summarized that really nicely, actually, and echoes a lot of thoughts from my presentation, but also generally where we sit at IUCN. I mean, certainly, as you say, it's readdressing the balance of too much focus on grey and built infrastructure. So there is this need to focus and highlight and recognize nature-based solutions, but at the same time to not go overboard so that the message is not heard to think that that's going to then be a silver bullet to solve everything either. It is really understanding the context-specific situations and possible options for solutions. And we've seen in our work that mixing and having combinations of built and natural seem to work the best, providing flexibility in your system, but also providing essential services that you can only get from built infrastructure, and also needing to respond to critical development needs for large areas in the world. And I think just one key thing that Carrie brought up in response to one of the questions is language. I completely agree, and I think this is really critical as well, is being able to engage with those who might not necessarily be aware or understand nature-based solutions from different sectors, and find a way to engage. That's why we talk about natural infrastructure, because we found that talking to water managers, talking to engineers and infrastructure engineers, that rang a bell to them, and that made sense to them. So it's very much about trying to find the right language to talk to people, and then provide that space for talking about these issues and finding a balance. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks. Lucy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really positive to see that there was a lot of kind of consistent messaging across the different presentations. I think there was a recognition as well that we do need to kind of work together collectively to solve these issues. And I think it was great to see that there was that kind of alignment, and the kind of, the building of the evidence base to support these solutions. And yeah, I totally agree, the kind of the transferring then of that across into sort of business cases for different audiences to kind of motivate and catalyze action. I think, yeah, from our work here with business, we've kind of framed that very much as kind of risk and opportunity to kind of try and to do that, to kind of engage. Yeah, I think that has helped to mobilize businesses to start to think about water and how they need to respond in a way that kind of, is broader than their own supply chains. So yeah, I think that's positive, and yeah, that provides a good foundation to build on going forward.
Great, thank you. Hey, Carrie?
Yeah, I think the theme that really stuck out to me across the presentations was the need to engage with what might have seemed like unusual partners in the past. Lucy talked about engaging with business. David talked about engaging with agriculture, and Rebecca and Catherine, talking about engaging with policymakers, utilities, others around nature-based solutions. And when we get into specific projects, also, it's a little bit, you have to get your hands a little bit more dirty than when we're working on gray infrastructure. And so I think that is often a big barrier, is that we need to, that engagement across sectors, but also with communities and others and smallholder farmers, which is what is required to implement these kinds of solutions. So I think that's something really important to highlight. And as my presentation focused on the co-benefits. So I think what the potential there is the opportunity to engage with not only those interested in water benefits, but others interested, working on climate or human health and well-being. And so that's something that's really exciting to me, is being able to engage not only within the water sector with different partners, but with others who are facing other kinds of global challenges.
Excellent. Well, thank you to all my panel for joining us today. I'd like to thank Rebecca Welling, Lucy Lee, Catherine Cross, who had to leave us already, Carrie Vigestol, and David Coates. Thank you all for joining me today. I know some of the panel and IWRA itself, we're all on Twitter, so look us up on social media and follow us. And if any of these presentations left you wanting to learn more, you can go ahead and check out our LinkedIn webpage. We'll soon have a little piece of this up, and you can continue the conversation, having questions, debate, discussion. And you can quickly go to our website in a few days, and we'll have recordings of this presentations up, and the PDFs of all the PowerPoints as well. So we'll have everything ready for you as soon as everyone's back from the World Water Forum in Brazil. So I hope everyone found that the insights provided today by our panel for World Water Day was really just as fascinating as I did. I mean, it gave me a lot to think about, and for my own work and my own material for the coming days. So I hope this has got a lot of creativity for everyone in my audience. And just remind everyone again that the webinar is brought to you by the International Water Resources Association. We're an over 40-year-old nonprofit, non-governmental educational organization that focuses on bridging disciplines and geographies and connecting professionals, students, individuals, corporations, and institutions, everyone who's really concerned with the sustainable use of the world's water resources. And if you want to learn more about the association or you want to become a member, you can go to www.iwra.org. So on behalf of the whole IWRA office, thank you for joining the webinar and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.